I'm going to keep the introductions of the speakers very short because you can read their full bios in the program. And our first speaker will be Frank Dobbin, who is a sociology professor at Harvard, and he's been studying issues of diversity and retention of women in the workplace for many years. And with that, Frank?
And how many minutes are you giving us?
About 15 minutes.
Thanks very much for inviting me. We're off to a great start, I think. Indeed, I've been studying corporate equal opportunity and diversity programs for many years. And one of the things that's frustrated me in studying corporate equal opportunity and diversity programs is that there's a lot of heat in the area. That is, there's a lot of enthusiasm for different kinds of programs in firms, but very little light. That is, no one much knows what's effective among all of the things that corporations do. So, in some ways, the best thing about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, particularly if you compare it with what other countries have done, is that it produced among firms a huge amount of enthusiasm and activity, and it produced a wide range of programmatic interventions within the firm, a wide range of innovations, dozens and dozens of things in the biggest companies, and quite a lot of variability across companies in what they do. So that's one of the best things about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's also one of the worst things about the Civil Rights Act because companies do all kinds of things. Nobody really knows what works. Companies add programs one on top of another. They add programs that they don't actually implement. And we really don't have an idea as employees, as employers, or as judges of what companies can do to promote opportunity, to promote diversity in the firm. So today I thought I would talk about some results from a study I've been doing with my co-author who's listed there, Alexandra Kalev at Tel Aviv University, a study of the efficacy of different kinds of corporate diversity and equal opportunity interventions. I won't talk about everything, but I have been trying to give this talk as often as possible whenever it more or less fills the bill, because I would like to see firms and judges pay more attention to what's effective and move towards supporting programs that actually can make a change in the workplace, rather than programs that look nice and cost a lot of money and that you can put up on the website, but that don't actually change what the workforce looks like. The analysis I'll talk about today depends on data provided by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They collect data from employers with at least 100 workers every year, and they have since 1971. And these data are confidential, but through the good graces of two champions, I think, of social science research at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Ron Edwards and Bliss Cartwright, a number of social scientists, mostly sociologists and economists, now have access to the data. So we combine these data with our own retrospective survey of employer practices from I'll look at 816 firms in most of the analyses I show you today. So what we can do is we can trace the evolution of corporate practice firm by firm. So we know when a particular big box store in Peoria first had a diversity training program. We know it was in 1988. And then we can trace change in, what I'll talk about today is change in management composition, in the diversity of managers. So we know when they first had a Hispanic woman in management. We know if it was in 1986 or 1992. So we know if it was before or after the program. And through statistical analysis over time series analysis, we can figure out which program interventions actually change the composition of management. Which things actually lead to changes in the number of women in management, the number of Hispanic women, the number of Asian American men. I have more slides than time, so. In the sample, this is what change in the managerial workforce looks like. This is the decline of white men among managers and the rise of white women. And here are other race and ethnic groups broken down by gender. So there are increases in white women across the board and increases in all of these other groups. I'm going to talk about 3 general approaches to promoting diversity or opening equal opportunity in firms. The most popular thing from the beginning has been various kinds of efforts to end managerial bias. So from the early 1960s, our definition of the problem was that managers were biased and that we needed to somehow change their behavior. So firms do a lot of things to attack managerial bias, but 3 of the most popular things they do are to try to rule it out through bureaucratic procedures first. So I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of rules, but we look at dozens of different bureaucratic procedures, such as salary classification systems to make sure women aren't underpaid, job descriptions to make sure African Americans aren't prevented from applying for jobs for which they are eligible, et cetera, that were adopted by employers over time as a way to prevent individual managers from acting on bias, to make sure that promotion was based on ability. A second thing employers have been doing, particularly lately, is to try to train away bias. So get groups of managers in a room and subject them to diversity training and try to show them that indeed they're biased. And they need to be aware that they're biased when they're making decisions. And the third thing that firms have done in this realm is to try to punish bias or reward lack of bias through bonuses and particularly through diversity performance evaluations where your annual raise or your likelihood of promotion will be tied in part to how you do on diversity. So you remember the slides where I showed you change, just 2 slides ago. Change in the composition of women, white women in management and racial and ethnic groups. So the next slides I'll show you, the main slides, show the percent change in the proportion of managers who are from a particular group following the intervention at about 5 or 10 years after the intervention. And so the question is, do these interventions produce any statistically significant change or not? And if they produce statistically significant change, is it toward more diversity or is it toward less diversity? So this is what happens to firms who put in hiring and promotion rules. Note that the scale on the left is 0 to 6 plus or minus. And in general, the pattern is that not much happens. And I could show you a dozen other practices along these lines. So these are hiring guidelines. Do you write down guidelines for how people are hired to make sure that managers don't hire their cousins rather than the African American man who came in to apply for the job? Promotion guidelines with the same logic. They don't promote their cousin. And firing guidelines to ensure that women and minorities are not differentially fired. The big picture here is this doesn't work. And across dozens of practices, we see that it doesn't work. Diversity training and evaluations. This is where all the money goes. That is, this is the thing that these are the things that consultants really promote to corporations, and these are the things that corporations spend most of the average corporation spend most of their diversity, equal opportunity budget on. these things don't really work either. What we see are scattered positive effects for diversity training, and only one negative effect for diversity performance evaluations for managers. So in our interviews with managers, with line managers in particular, we ask, why don't these things work? And we hear a very clear and consistent story, that managers see that they become defined as the problem. They're antagonized by these kinds of measures. They see these solutions as accusatory, stigmatizing, and as alienating. But we find another set of practices that are much more effective at promoting diversity in firms. Practices that give managers protégés, in particular mentoring programs, task forces which bring managers from different departments together to brainstorm for how the firm might promote diversity, and full-time diversity managers, who are now often called chief diversity officers. So what these practices have in common is that they bring together managers to come up with a solution, to think about, in the case of mentors, what's the career that this young woman who I'm the mentor of might have in the firm? How can I get her into the kind of job she ought to have? In the case of task forces, what are our specific problems in this insurance firm in retaining women in actuarial jobs? What's going wrong and how can we solve it? And diversity managers do much the same thing. They look at the specific problems of the firm and try to figure out solutions. So note here that the metric is completely different. That is, the scale on the left is not from 0 to 6, it's from 0 to 40. I put up network programs just to compare them to mentoring programs. Not all kinds of social connections help women and members of underrepresented groups move up in firms. One kind does, that is, a connection with a mentor seems to help women and members of minority groups move up. In a pretty big way, too. So if you look at Hispanic women, Asian men, and Asian women, companies have 1 or 2% of managers in each of these groups. But what this means is that the independent effect, the net effect of these programs is to move a company from 1% to 1.4%, which over 5 or 6 years, it's numerically not a big change, but in a big company, it means something has changed. So mentoring programs have huge effects virtually across the board. Diversity task forces have very positive effects for every group, and diversity managers show positive effects for almost all groups. Another thing that we find is very effective is special recruitment programs. So ask managers to go out and recruit women. That is, send them to colleges and say, your job is to recruit women managers, not just to recruit. Send them to colleges and say, your job is to recruit African Americans or members of minority groups. So these effects are not as big, but they're at least positive and consistent. This is from my colleague, Alexandra Kalev's work. She has a paper in American Sociological Review last year, where she compares programs that put lots of people in lower level positions in touch with managers, so that expand the contacts of managers, with similar programs that don't do that. So here she compares self-directed work teams, where everybody in the firm is on a team that's self-managed, and the team has people from all kinds of different positions on it, with traditional problem-solving teams, which are usually, the managers of 4 departments who are trying to solve some problem. And she shows that these self-directed work teams, which really put managers in touch with lots of people in lower-level positions, people who they wouldn't usually know, have positive effects, at least, on white women and African-American men and women. But the problem-solving teams don't. In fact, they have negative effects. In all of these slides, if you see a bar, the effect is statistically significant. If you see no bar, it means nothing's happening. Similarly, cross-training programs where management trainees are moved around to different departments and meet different managers, have strong effects on women and African Americans in management. Whereas traditional job training programs, where you're in a room like this and speakers come in and tell you how to manage, don't have those effects. And here again, in both of these kinds of programs, you're putting managers in touch with the kinds of people they wouldn't normally get to know. The bad news is that firms don't often get it right. In particular, the things that work the best. So this is the prevalence of these programs in 800 firms. The things that work the best, mentoring programs, diversity managers, and diversity task forces, of the first 6 things I looked at, are among the lowest in prevalence. And the things that we know really don't work, training, diversity evaluations, and network programs, are among the highest. So the bottom line is that firms need to stop trying to eradicate bias. They need to try to get managers to lead here, and they need to expose managers to more people. See, I'm over time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Sandra Bushby, who is the Director of Global Diversity and Inclusion Strategy at Pfizer. She has a keen focus on women's advancement in the workplace and was a founding board member of the Network of Executive Women and the recipient of a Catalyst Award. So with that, Sandra.
So good morning. I'm going to start by, as the moderator mentioned, I'm currently with Pfizer. Formerly, I was with KPMG. I've been in industry for some time with a focus on integrating the unique perspective of global diverse voice into business strategy. So I have to put a disclaimer out there. First disclaimer will be that I've not published a book. I've not done a research study. I'm not a commissioner. You might be saying, well, then why are you here? Oh, yeah, one other clarifying point. I am not a lawyer from George or NYU or, Harvard or whatnot either. So you might ask yourself quite rightly, well, then what are you doing here? I am here because I do represent the remaining 90% of the global workforce that is not described by all of the above. And as that representation of that 90%, I'm the person who's on the ground. I'm the person who's on the ground who takes the fight that these professionals and intellectual capital professionals are fighting for. I take that knowledge and I make it work within an organization. And so that's why I'm here to talk to you today. So with that understanding that I will not be quoting statistics, well, you wouldn't have gotten that from me anyway. But what I will be talking to you about is real time, how we make this work, how we've been making this work. Now, I'm going to focus on describing that to you by discussing unconscious bias. Not mine, yours. It's always more fun that way. Well, how so? Well, let's face it, we all have unconscious bias. When you heard Pfizer, you had an uncontrollable reaction in your brain. It was not a conscious decision, but right away, one of possibly 4 things popped in. First, for some of you, you grabbed your cell phone, hit speed dial to your buddy litigator, thinking, ooh, I might have something for him here. Or one of those uncontrolled automatic responses might have been an image of the 1920s, retro, Caucasian white male, US-centric led organizations. Another unconscious thought that may have popped in would be from our granola community. That would be the holistic, alternative medicine organization that, or belief processes that hand out the book Our Daily Meds every holiday season and on every birthday occasion, thinking that perhaps we're out there to actually make the world unhealthier. I guarantee you what you didn't think of when you heard Pfizer was the 3,000 women, rural women in an extremely impoverished global location that Pfizer last year equipped with skills in order to find work so that they can sustain their families. I'm also pretty sure that the automatic response and thought that entered your mind did not include the fact that Pfizer has an entire business unit, an entire business, if you will, company that's focused on global access. The sole purpose of this company is to create socially responsible, if you will, business solution to making sure we're reaching the billions that do not have access to medicine and health care, making sure that they get that. And I am 100% certain that when you heard the word Pfizer, you didn't think about or conjure immediately to your prefrontal cortex. Our Groton, New London facility, where we have an African American colleague resource group, network group, that decreased the mortality rate in an African region when they discovered that there was unconscious bias in the diagnosis by the Dutch medical providers in that location, and implemented a very aggressive minimizing unconscious bias in the medical profession and diagnosis process. And I'm equally certain that when I said Pfizer, you didn't think of an action team, a 6-person action team at Pfizer of Middle East male managers that solved for and created in Latin America an LGBT community, a network to support that unique perspective and point of view. Unconscious bias can be powerful. And what you just heard is exactly why global corporations and the power that they can bring, if you will, as a global corporation need to drive social responsible solutions. What you heard was the power behind what a global corporation can do to making that happen. Now picture 1, 2, 3. Just give me 3 of the Fortune 100 focused in this area, and I will show you powerful global change. A lot of it starts, though, with unconscious bias. That's what I want to talk to you about today. Now, within that context, so how do we create this win-win? I agree with everything that was just presented. Diversity and inclusion training, traditional forum, doesn't work. I agree that infrastructure alone and processes and protocol aren't going to get you where you need to go. Many reasons for that, and hopefully if we have time, we'll get to that towards the end or in the Q&A as well. Well, what I'd like to point out, that would be the non-holistic pharmaceutical dry mouth that I've got. What I want to point out, and not using statistics, not using research or eloquent, I'm sure I'm going to say something that's against the law. So let me just say, given that, we do have Pfizer legal counsel here. I'm invoking legal privilege, okay? All of it. I don't know the law, but I'm hoping that hocus pocus works. I don't know. But within I'm sure I will contradict lots of research that's out there. But what I'm talking about is what works and what we're doing and what we're seeing making a difference. So it may be counterintuitive, but it's working. So let's discuss that. I agree. As he said, diversity train, I don't think that's powerful. That doesn't mean Pfizer, however, doesn't develop multicultural global skills within our workforce. We absolutely do. It does not mean that we don't address and hold accountable and strive for a true understanding of culture-to-culture relationship. We must, or how can a business survive in a global economy? So we do this. We do this using several different principles that we hope that in 5 years, if you came and researched, you'll see some difference, because we're incorporating those things you've just heard. So what we've done is we've created processes using combination of factors to decrease unconscious bias in the workforce. We are focused solely on minimizing unconscious bias, and in so doing, increasing globally inclusive behaviors and ownership of those behaviors by everyone in our workforce. Does that make sense? So just a little head nod would be good. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, what we've done is we've created, using experiential learning and action learning principles, a process that we're seeing great results with. It incorporates within that process action research components within that learning, or that, if you will, output process. And we are creating, as Dr. Dobbs just described, action teams that are formed cross-culturally, cross-geography, cross-position, cross-gender, cross-ethnicity, cross-age, cross-experience, cross-discipline of study. We have a whole lot of scientists at Pfizer. Trying to balance that can be a challenge sometimes, right? So cross-work style diversity to create an impact. So there was a saying out there, and it actually originated by Lao Tzu. And I'll paraphrase, and basically what it says, until I know what I don't know, I don't need to know it. Until I know what I don't know, I don't need to know it. It will not register. You look at the way the brain works, connecting, it's not going to hit me. This is why a lot of diversity training doesn't work. So what we have done is we've created, if you will, artificial yet impactful situations to put leaders and managers in a position to understand quite safely, but still with bumps and bruises, exactly what they don't know, so they can then figure out what they need to do to know and to go solve for it. Some of those examples I gave you earlier are the results of the action teams that I'm bringing out now, or what I'm discussing now. So bottom line, here's what we do. We take a group of managers. Right now we have 270, if you will, global inclusion action teams around the world. So we take manager level, mid-manager, we bring them together from different countries. It's very intentional that they are from different countries working on this action team, because during this process we are creating cross-global and global competencies, leadership competencies, and I have a list of those. Whoever's interested, come in later, I'll email them to you. But based on 5 leading research documents and whatnot, we're embedding this as well. But more importantly, we bring all these very different diversity elements together. So cross-gender, cross-geography, cross-culture. So you'll have the dominant culture that might be U.S. You might have a dominant relationship culture represented there as well. And we ask them to get together and solve unconscious bias. And that's what we do. We do emphasize work style diversity as a key issue, but we don't tell them how to solve it. We don't tell them where to solve it. Just as he just described, we get them together and say, figure it out. How do we decrease unconscious bias in this region, in this here? And they work together to figure out what the issue is. They have to go in and meet with a lot of leaders, a lot of colleagues, and if they don't, what happens is the solution doesn't work, and they learn and they have to redo that. But through that actual action experience, they get in, they bump their knees, they scrape their elbows, and they learn what it means to lead an inclusive global organization. And in the process of doing that, they solve a whole lot. Now, it's key to remember as I'm describing this process, this one small avenue of how we apply some of the things that you've heard this morning, that the measure of success for these action teams is not the completion of the project. It is not the project itself. Now, at the end of this project, if you will, or intervention, they do present out to leadership that solution, and they make a recommendation. No, go, no go. Do we move this forward? Do we not? And that itself is not the measure. The measure is their demonstration of inclusive behaviors and their region president demonstration of inclusive behaviors. They do peer evaluation at the end based on inclusive behaviors, not the project, not the revenue output, not the containing of cost. Could people see them demonstrating inclusive behaviors? Did the peers see them cross-global, multicultural, negotiating in a proper format that represented and respected my cultural orientation, understanding of where I come from as a culture? And do you even know yours? Do you know the roots of who you are and why you think the way you do? Because if you don't, how are you going to manage that unconscious bias? So you see, we pull all these elements into, if you will, an action team. Put them out there, have them go for it, and we have a lot of great solutions. For example, we had an action team launch in Costa Rica focused on work-life. They actually established a country women's network, if you will. They coordinated with 2 other global organizations to do this, and they worked with the president to make that happen. This was a mid-level team of managers, both men and women, who made this happen. And before you jump to your own unconscious bias conclusions that work life is a women's issue, let me just stop you there. What was the driving force? Yes, they have a big issue there, but it was because the men were burning out. It was the men, based on their research there, indicated they needed work life. Something to think of. So that said then, so the measure would be inclusive behavior. It's about action and putting them in the motion and letting them learn experientially what works and what does not work. We've had some great success in that. We still have 270 teams acting, moving forward. We do have a failure rate of 10%. Yes. But we have a success rate of 90%, making a difference in the world while contributing value-added, relevant business solutions. All right. Thank you.
I'm only realizing now that I should have sat here, right? Next time. Our next speaker is Rika Iani Rodriguez. I apologize if I mispronounced your name, who is a co-director of the Restaurant Opportunity Center of New York, ROC New York, a nonprofit restaurant workers center that fights for improved working conditions for restaurant workers. And she's done work on ending discrimination in that industry. Rika?
Hi, everyone. I'm Reka. Like Yolanda just mentioned, the Restaurant Opportunity Center was founded after 9/11 to help workers displaced from the World Trade Center and a number of different issues, mostly family support. But it soon changed, I think, when we realized the incredible imbalance of power with workers and corporations in the restaurant industry. And I think it's interesting that I've been invited up here to speak because I'm not speaking from the place of a corporation or an academic or anybody else talking about how we can make workplace diversity more important in the restaurant industry. I'm talking as an advocate, as myself a former restaurant worker and who works with restaurant workers every day, where discrimination is a huge problem. And we're still trying to figure out a way to make it better ourselves. And I'll go through some of those approaches. But I do want to say to everybody here, I think everybody in this room eats at restaurants in the least, so you have some connection to restaurants. And I think maybe some of you in the room have also been former restaurant workers yourself, so I hope you find this somewhat relevant. If you don't find any of those two things relevant, I think what is important to note is that the restaurant industry is incredibly important to our nation. I don't know if people here realize, but the restaurant industry is the fastest growing private sector employer in the nation, the largest private sector employer in the nation. And I think the big catch that makes things so different is that restaurant workers are what we consider to be a dispensable workforce, unlike what our keynote speaker, and I think Cynthia referred to this morning as, a catch. I guess like the law students in this room might be viewed to employers. Restaurant workers are certainly not viewed in that way, but it's a powerful industry and there's a lot of room for pressure on this industry to improve workplace conditions, and I think that's exactly the role that ROC serves. I do want to say something very, very important, once again, about the balance of power. Now, in our New York City restaurant industry, people always ask, well, are you unionized? And it's actually so far from the truth. Only 1% of the workers in this industry are union. And so that leaves 99% of workers without any kind of institutional support and really to fend for themselves to create better working conditions. Meanwhile, you have the National Restaurant Association, who's the lobby for employers, who's the 10th largest lobby in Congress. So you can imagine the kind of power struggle that exists. You have the National Restaurant Association, even in New York, the New York State Restaurant Association, who fought very hard from getting paid sick days passed for low-wage workers in the city. And I could promise you they were one of the hugest players in the ear of our council member Christine Quinn in making sure that paid sick days wasn't passed for low-wage workers. But I think the thing that I really want to talk about, and the thing that I think maybe makes sense for today's panel, is to talk about what does, why even care about the restaurant industry? I mean, really, are we really fighting for, wonderful jobs in the industry? That's people's question. And I think the thing that's important to point out is yes, for low-wage workers, the restaurant industry offers a very viable profession. You can be a busser or a runner in a restaurant and earn $30,000, $40,000. You could be a server in fine dining restaurants and earning anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 very easily, especially the higher up the ranks in the finer dining the restaurant you go to. So yes, I absolutely believe that living wage jobs are possible in this industry, and I think diversity is not a problem in this industry, and it's something that happens all the time. People say, well, what are you complaining about? I go into restaurants and there's immigrants waiting on me. There's totally, it's so many people of color, there's so many immigrants, what's the problem? And we say, that's fine. There are very many immigrants. I mean, you're talking about 70% immigrant workforce, 40% estimated to be undocumented in this industry, but really look at who's getting what kind of positions. So diversity is not a problem, but what we call occupational segregation is a problem. It's very problematic, I think, amongst many low-wage workers. You see it most prevalent in the restaurant industry, and I think it's because the restaurant industry, has remnants of racism. I mean, look up 30 years ago, you would not see a black worker, a black waiter waiting on you, and nor were black waiters allowed to exist in the restaurant, nor would you see women waiting on you. So it's definitely still existing, and I think the thing that also makes it so, I feel like I'm dying down a little bit. The thing that also makes it so apparent in this restaurant industry is that this is an industry that cares about image. It is about who is the most beautiful person, who is the most chic or sophisticated person that is waiting on you. And it sounds a little bit silly when you think about it, because it is, after all, restaurant work, but I could promise you it's an extreme driving force behind employers and behind different restaurant companies' motivation to do what they do. Did I die down a little bit? You could hear. Okay. So I think another very important thing to think about when you're thinking about restaurants, you might think, well, there's thousands of restaurants in the city, and really, are they very big, important corporate players? And I could promise you they are. They may seem like they're independently owned small restaurants, and there certainly are many of them, but your biggest trendsetters in the industry, the one that people really look up to design their own practices and see, what, for example, kind of workforce I want to have, are conglomerates. They're restaurant conglomerates. They're what we call mini empires who yield a tremendous amount of power in this industry. They are the Mario Batalis of the world, the Daniel Boulud's, I could name 1,000. They're the celebrity chefs that you see on TV, and they are very, very powerful in the city, and they do set the trend. What happened about now 5 years ago is a group of 10 Bangladeshi and Latino workers came from Daniel Boulud. Is anybody familiar with Daniel Boulud? He's one of the only 5-star chefs in the city. They came to us and they said, we don't understand what's going on. We've been at this restaurant for, 8 years. We've learned the menu. In fact, when white workers come in with no experience, we train them and they get the positions over us. And we understood that this is a problem, and these workers did fight, and it didn't come from an easy sit-down conversation with the company. It came from aggressive tactics, like really calling the industry out as a racist industry, from protesting, from having media pieces, and from having a lawsuit, and ultimately, by force, I guess you could say, or by incredible pressure, workers were able to win raises in their workplace. They were able to win, money. They were able to to win an EEOC monitored promotions policy, and they were able to win tips, raises and tips. And so I think, you know, the thing that was so important about this campaign to us is that it gave us a platform to finally be able to call out problems of real occupational segregation and discrimination in this industry. But we had to take it a step farther because, once again, we sounded just like complainers. That's what everybody says. You're complaining. What are you talking about? Once again, they're lucky they even have jobs in the first place. And so it prompted us to do the first ever study done on race and gender discrimination in the restaurant industry. We launched a 2-year study known as the Great Service Divide. And I think what made this study so cool is that we used what we call match pair testing, which some of you might be familiar with. It was used a lot, called auditing, testing for litigation and housing in the 60s and 70s. We applied it to restaurants, where we trained over a number of about 20, 30 different workers, white and people of color, to go test 200 of the most fine dining, highest grossing, powerful restaurants in the city. And I think that this, the results of this study enabled us to call out what we already knew, but hopefully actually provided some empirical evidence to the others who cared that this is a problem in the industry. The first thing that we saw just by virtue of canvassing, in fact, a lot of NYU law students participated in the canvassing portion, where we canvassed more than 55 dining restaurants. And canvassing simply meant going into different restaurants and counting who was in which positions. And that showed that despite the fact that 3/4 of the workforce are immigrant, white workers, it was actually 70% of the observed front of the house positions, meaning, remember I was talking about those $60,000, $70,000 server bartending jobs, were occupied by white males. Women only had 32% of observed front of the house positions. And the management positions, it was 79% white. And so this actually was further quantified by EEO1 data that we did get from a labor economist, Mark Bendick, who I'm sure you're familiar with, worked very closely on the study. So the thing about the match pair testing, which was even more juicy, because I think people would say, well, sure, you have people, once again, in these positions, that's wonderful, but what does it really mean? It doesn't mean that there's bias necessarily from the employer. And so we, the match pair testing helped prove that a little bit more. Just some interesting stories. People of color were by far less likely to be interviewed. And when they were interviewed, they were twice as likely to be probed about their qualifications. In one situation, we had a Jamaican tester that in real life is a worker at a very fine dining restaurant in the city. The employer asked him to draw out a picture of the restaurant that he supposedly worked at because they didn't believe that he could work at this kind of restaurant. The white worker wasn't tested at all and actually was given a second interview. That's just one example. I don't want to get into all the details, but I do want to say that the testing study itself actually allowed us to be able to call out what's the problem in the restaurant industry. But we did engage employers. In fact, we did 50 interviews with employers. And back to what our keynote speaker was talking about this morning, and truly wanting to learn about what the challenges are with equal opportunity in the industry, I think I can't wholeheartedly say that we truly took it from a neutral standpoint and really wanted to hear what they had to say. We're advocates after all, but we were stringent about it, and we do need to understand the challenges. So we did those 50 interviews with employers, and I think the things that kept popping up over and over were, I guess they will call it challenges, I may call it excuses, but they would say, well, what does it mean when you have a worker with an accent waiting on a table? Like, customers can't really understand them. And that enabled us to say, well, why is it that when we had a white French speaker test at a restaurant and paired him with an African French speaking worker, the white tester was always given the job, because in this industry, being French or European is sophisticated, and it's something that the industry holds very dearly onto this notion. It's a big barrier that we have to face. Another thing that kept coming up from employers was, well, this is an industry where, customers like to feel like they're being waited on from people from the same socioeconomic status. They want their servers to be able to talk about travels to Europe and about the opera. And that just leaves huge challenges. If you're an immigrant coming from Mexico, chances are you're not going to be speaking about the opera. You might know your wine because that's what you've been trained to do, but you might not be able to speak that. So that just presents some very, very severe challenges that I think might be, even more highlighted than most low-wage industries where the worker is just entirely out of the sphere of customers in the first place, but also in retail. I think everybody's familiar with Abercrombie and Fitch lawsuit where it was the same thing in retail. I know I have a few minutes, so I just want to, wrap it up by saying a couple things. So we as advocates are doing the smart thing, I believe, although not nearly as comprehensively or with the know-how that we need to, but we are trying to engage the employer. And we've done this in a couple of ways. There's pressure right now coming from workers for better employment opportunities in the industry. I mean, Rock is one of the leaders in this, and then you have restaurant lawyers, and restaurant workers filing lawsuits up and down. I'm sure you're hearing about them. You have pressure from policymakers. Our Department of Labor just issued new wage regulations regulating the industry. And there's also pressure now through organizing of consumers and even of the market and peer restaurant owners themselves. So just to quickly point on to what Rock has done with this, we have created what we call a restaurant industry roundtable, and this is a convening of about 25 what we consider high-road employers who are dedicated to providing things like paid sick leave, dedicated to training all workers and actually promoting internally instead of externally and promoting workers of color into these living wage positions. Mostly when you hear about about restaurants and social responsibility. You hear about the green restaurant movement. Everybody's joining on to this. There's the Green Restaurant Association. There's the Slow Food Snail of Approval. There's kosher standards right now. And it's wonderful and great that we're starting to use corporate responsibility and pressuring restaurants to think about the quality of food and whether the food's locally sourced. But this gives us also an opportunity to put pressure on the companies to also think about better working conditions. And I think it's definitely starting to brew. And I think it's a very, very new phenomenon. And it's going to take a lot of work from advocates and policymakers and students and consumers to push consumers to think about, to push employers to think about corporate responsibility in this way. But it's happening. And I have no time, but I'm going to take 1 minute as a favor and as a show of solidarity. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. They are this fantastic group of very marginalized farm workers in Immokalee, Florida, which people probably haven't even heard of Immokalee for. This group is amazing because what they've been able to do is put big pressure on corporations, so on companies like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, to further pressure farmers to provide the farmers who are giving their food to them to have better working conditions and better wages for their farmers. And the reason why I'm making this announcement to the group is that the new campaign that they have is against Trader Joe's. And Trader Joe's, many of you may or may not know, but NYU actually leases space to the Trader Joe's in Union Square. And so this person asked me to let you all know that there's going to be a protest outside of Trader Joe's on Sunday at 12 to get Trader Joe's to do the right thing that Whole Foods has done, namely to sign an agreement with CIW to force their farmers to provide better working conditions. I know I went over my time, but I did do that as a favor, and I hope people here will ask questions of, I will tell you the name. I actually did not write down the name. I will. If you are interested in going, I will tell you the name of the person from NYU who's working on this with CIW, but that's it for me. I'm sorry I went over.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Paul Son, who is a legal co-director of the National Employment Law Project, a think and do tank focused on the challenges facing the U.S. labor market in the 21st century economy. It's very lofty. Paul.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I thank the Review of Law and Social Change for putting on this provocative symposium. I'm going to be discussing the role that progressive action by employers can and has played in promoting decent wages in low-wage industries. This is an area where my organization is very active. We are a public policy advocacy group. We work, among other things, we work on strengthening the minimum wage in the United States, and as part of that, partner with employers whenever we can. I'm going to use case studies, use examples from two key low-wage industries, the retail industry and the home healthcare industry. And I'll discuss two interrelated roles that low-wage employers can play in supporting improving wages in their industries. The first is leading by example by improving their own wages and working conditions. And the second is politically supporting efforts to improve wages broadly across their industry by raising the minimum wage. But first, I'm going to set the stage with some economic context, just as briefly as I can. Our economy has been shifting towards low-wage service jobs for more than 40 years. These are many of the fastest growing industries and occupations in the economy, where tens of millions of Americans spend their careers. And this trend has been worsened by the Great Recession. The jobs that we lost were very broadly distributed across the wage distribution, including a lot of high-wage jobs in manufacturing, construction, and the like. The job growth that we've seen over the last year has been very disproportionately in low-wage industries. The million jobs created last year, 65% of them were in low-wage industries such as temp services, retail, and restaurants. So the loss of manufacturing jobs, probably the permanent shrinking of our construction market with the kind of housing bubble bursting, really are exacerbating what has been a many decades-long trend. A big factor in the wages that are paid in those low-wage industries that are growing is the erosion of our minimum wage. If it had kept pace with inflation over the past 40 years, it would be more than $10 an hour today. Instead, it's even after being raised, it's still just $7.25 an hour federally, somewhat higher in other states. And that is a very significant contributor to the growing economic inequality we've seen in our economy. Groups like us believe raising the minimum wage is a key public policy for improving jobs at the bottom end of our economy. And even if there were some non-trivial job loss impact from that, we would still think it was actually a defensible public policy and a worthwhile trade-off. But politically, the economics around the effect on hiring of the minimum wage have really shifted substantially over the past 15 years, and that's been very politically helpful because there's now a substantial body of economic research suggesting that higher minimum wages result in little, if any, job loss. And politically, that is really super valuable because obviously it's easier to be able to argue that the minimum wage improves jobs with little trade-off regarding the number of jobs. This research, I'll be happy to go into it in more detail during the Q&A. It started 15 or so years ago with David Card and Alan Kruger's sort of seminal research comparing New Jersey and Pennsylvania's fast food industries when New Jersey raised the minimum wage. But there is a substantial body of research. The newest wave is coming out last year in this that looks at there's been a lot of experimentation with higher minimum wages during the 90s and 2000s, including wage hikes during 2007 through 2009 during the Great Recession. There's a really the most sophisticated to date body of research came out from a bunch of researchers at University of California, University of Massachusetts, and University of North Carolina, confirming past findings of no discernible job loss effect. So that's a key part of this landscape. I mean, these findings may be counterintuitive. That the idea that if labor is a commodity like any other, that an increase in price should result in a decrease in the purchase and how much labor employers purchase. But I think the explanation for these findings is that both the low-wage labor market, the commodity of human labor responds somewhat differently and in a more complicated fashion to changes in prices, and that particularly raising the minimum wage reduces churn across our labor market, and so reduces the kind of restaffing and rehiring costs that result from very high turnover in low-wage industries, which offsets a portion of the higher wage costs. There's also, I think the reality is that the cost of the wages for bottom-end workers is actually a really small factor in the economic health and hiring decisions of most low-wage industries, which are driven much more substantially by markets and consumer demand. We believe raising the minimum wage right now is actually especially important because it's a key form of fiscal stimulus. It's a way to put money in the economy by putting money in low-income workers' pockets who spend it at local businesses, and one of the few forms of fiscal stimulus that doesn't worsen budget deficits. And in fact, as I mentioned, the jobs that are starting to grow are, in fact, in the low-wage industries. They're growing, and there's actually a lot of very The other startling underappreciated thing is the major low-wage employers, the restaurant chains, the retail chains, the majority of them have their profit margins have rebounded to pre-recession levels, some of them record levels. They're sitting on record levels of cash on hand. So by many indicia, they are really in a solid economic position and able to afford higher wages. The role of businesses, that's all background. This panel is about, this symposium is about the role of businesses as progressive actors. And in the advocacy around wages, the role of businesses has really been crucial, both in showing that it's economically realistic to pay higher wages and in legitimizing politically calls to raise the minimum wage. I'm going to discuss these sort of two ways. I'll start by the role that businesses play in leading by example, the degree to which businesses that operate in low-wage industries are able to unilaterally improve jobs by electing to pay higher wages to their own employees. And I'll share some case studies. I'll start with one from the home care industry. And the key question here is to the degree to which it's feasible for low-wage employers, individual employers, to choose to lead by example, the degree to which competitive forces in the industries where they operate constrain their ability to do better than most of their peer firms. So starting with home care, which is one of our fastest growing industries, 3 of the top 10 fastest growing occupations are in home health care. It's driven by the aging of the population and the fact that the dominance of our economy by healthcare jobs. So it's a huge, fast-growing industry with really crappy wages, $8, $9 an hour are the median wages. And there's a really compelling, obvious case for better wages because the turnover is sky high, really compromises care, very little continuity of care when your home care worker is leaving every 3 months. But currently market conditions are very low wages. So I'm going to profile first discuss a group many of you may be familiar with. It's called Cooperative Home Care Associates. It's based in the Bronx in New York. It's a much profiled sort of a field innovator that was set up for the purpose of trying to be a high road home care agency to create better jobs. And they were founded a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago. Actually, they are a worker-owned cooperative, and their goal was to try to create better working conditions. And they succeeded in some regards. There are kind of model HR policies and staffing and management policies they've developed successfully. But on their core goal of raising wages, they really concluded that they had very little latitude, that the industry in which they operate is very substantially government funded. Actually, most Americans get their home health care when they're elderly through Medicaid. Actually, not just low-income Americans, but middle-class Americans too. It's the chief, so the government funds most of the jobs in this industry. They're not public jobs, they're contracted out, but they're chiefly government funded, and the budgetary pressures of Medicaid have kept the funding and the wages very low. So Cooperative Home Care determined that on their own, they had until they did something about the funding streams and the reimbursement rates, they really couldn't improve jobs, which actually led them to launch a couple of sister organizations that are key advocates for changing conditions in the industry and have had some success. The next firm I'll profile is Addus Healthcare. It's actually a for-profit corporate home health care chain, one of the largest in the United States with tens of thousands of employees in 19 states. And they are very kind of committed to the high road to improving wages and working conditions. I think they got there through an evolution. Like many of the higher road firms, they got there in part because they were partially unionized and were pushed towards paying higher wages and developed a partnership with their union, SEIU. And so unilaterally, they also implemented some reforms around wages and working conditions. They pay workers for travel time among clients. They pay overtime voluntarily, even though federal law shockingly exempts home health care workers from minimum wage and overtime. But on the core question of wages, they also really came up across the roadblock of the funding streams and the financing of their industry. But they then partnered with the union, SEIU, and actually began working to change those reimbursement systems. So in states like Illinois, they've raised pay $2 or3 an hour by working to reform the reimbursement rates through political action with the union. And actually next week, we're kicking off a minimum wage campaign in Illinois to substantially raise the minimum wage, and the Addus CEO is going to be there at the launch. So they really have lent their political voice to trying to implement public policy change to improve conditions in their industry to allow them to do what they'd like to do. And so I think the lesson from these examples is that, especially in industries like home health care that are very substantially constrained by public funding streams, there's only limited latitude for individual employers to raise wages, through, on their own. And really, it takes systemic industry-wide public policy change to improve conditions. And some of these leading employers have lent their voice to that. Next, I'll turn to retail, which is not a government-funded industry and maybe tells a different story. It's one of our largest low-wage industries. Only about 8% of all workers work in retail, but 20% of the nation's low-wage workforce is there. The wages are notoriously low. Starting wages typically $8, $9 an hour at places like Walmart, Target, all the big chains. But there's one very well-recognized counterexample. It's really stunning. Costco, which starts workers at $11 an hour. They have average wages of $17 an hour compared to 12 or 13 at places like Walmart or Sam's Club. They provide health care even for part-timers. Partly because of their higher wages, they have radically lower turnover rates, only 17% as opposed to more like 45% for competitors like Sam's Club or Walmart. And their profits per employee actually are substantially higher through the model they've developed. They're, I think, approximately $21,000 a year per employee profits versus $11,000 for Sam's Club and Walmart. Costco actually has a really fascinating history, and I think there's been some academic research on it. It actually was founded, it grew out of Price Club, which was founded by Saul Price, a kind of lefty trial lawyer from San Diego, who kind of after he got out of the service, I think it was, developed this whole warehouse club idea, and it evolved. So he really is the grandfather of the business model of both Walmart and Costco, of his, this industry which has evolved with, with different niches that use very, very different business models. But he really invented the big box and but because he was committed to decent wages, he actually, that was sort of a hallmark of Price Club from the beginning. At one point, he voluntarily unionized. At least I believe he voluntarily did. I'm not a total expert on the whole history. And then Price Club eventually merged with and grew into Costco. So Costco is a company that is it's partially unionized by the Teamsters, but not entirely, and has been a real, kind of progressive leader in this field. Now, a key question is how feasibly other employers could make this shift. I mean, Costco, on the one hand, has carved out a niche which is arguably more profitable. They cater to more high-end consumers and higher margins. So it's, there's one might argue that it's not as so broadly replicable by low-wage, mass retailers that serve low-income consumers. On the other hand, there's been analyses that Walmart could raise pay $2 or $3 an hour with only a modest hit on prices if they passed it all along into prices less than 1% because of their scale of operations. Presumably the answer is in between. There's sort of a range of range of latitude where firms can improve wages on their own, but ultimately there are probably industry-wide limits, which is why it's so important to raise the minimum wage to improve conditions broadly across industries. And that's why, and Costco in that regard has been a really crucial national leader. In 2006, their CEO, Jim Sinegal, publicly endorsed raising the minimum wage and did a bunch of media, and was really very active, committed to scarce time to it. Folks may have seen today, the firm is a very active leader in trying to defend the new health care reform. They've been doing a lot of work around that. They actually stand in very stark contrast to Trader Joe's, where folks may have seen the really crazy op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by the Trader Joe's CEO, which opposed health care reform last year and said something that, like, if you eat well, you don't need health insurance. It was just, it was totally insane. And so one question is, well, why do firms do this? And it's sort of a, there's a combination. I think there's a variety of impulses. I think the folks at Costco are genuinely progressive people. I think they really take pride in their role as corporate leaders for things moving the economy in a good direction. I think there's probably, though, also the fact that they're half unionized and probably would like to keep it that way and prefer not to be fully unionized is another motivation. So I think all of these studies, from them I'd like to just draw just a few very brief lessons. That first, there's a substantial role for firms to lead by example, but industry and competitive environments really do impose limits, making public policy reform, particularly for wages, raising the minimum wage, crucial. And there too, though, the voices of employers are just so fundamental in politically being able to make progress and raise wages. And so it just makes all the difference having employers saying this is economically realistic and supporting this action. And that's why there's a real need for more organizing, building the progressive business community that supports policies like this. And there's really been a lot of growth in the last few years. We've seen it around healthcare reform, the paid sick days movement, minimum wage. There were new progressive business networks, the Main Street Alliance, Small Business Majority, Businesses for Shared Prosperity. During the Q&A, we could talk more about them, but there's really been a growing and a challenging of the degree to which the U.S. Chamber, National Restaurant Association, National Federation of Independent Business really speak for most employers. So I think this is a really fertile area, the kind of progressive business movement, and I look forward to more discussion about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. So I'm the last speaker. There's something nice about going last, right? And then I'm going to try to sort of turn the end of my remarks into the beginning of our shared discussion, so I won't take too long. My focus in talking about corporations as progressive actors is to talk about work-family balance as a question of family economic security. We've heard a lot of diverse perspectives from all different kinds of businesses, different industries, and different issues of reform. What I'll do is talk briefly about a few policy handles that my organization, A Better Balance, is working on, and then sort of raise some of the larger questions that I think all of the speakers have raised. Before I talk about the policy, just a few statistics to set the stage. I'm sure many of you guys know that our country sadly lags very far behind the rest of the world in supporting working families. In a study of 173 countries, the U.S. stands with Liberia, Swaziland, and Papua New Guinea as the only countries that provide no paid maternity leave. And as you probably know, women now make up half of all workers in the U.S. payroll, and women's wages are essential to their family's survival. What we see is that the workplace hasn't really caught up to that reality, right? So that the workplace is often still structured around the idea that there's a stay-at-home parent to stay behind and take care of children, the sick, or the elderly. And Sandra was completely right in saying that work-life issues and diversity is not solely a women's issue. Studies show that more and more fathers are taking more time to be involved in their families and want to spend more time on childcare. And then one other angle that we haven't heard about yet today is on the other end of the spectrum, work-family balance isn't just about having children and babies, it's about taking care of an aging family member. In 2008, nearly 1 out of every 5 employed people in the country was serving as an unpaid family caregiver to someone over the age of 50. And that trend is just growing. So what needs to happen? Well, 5 years ago, I co-founded A Better Balance with a bunch of lawyers from the women's rights movement to really figure out where are the places that we can have an impact and try to enact structural change. And I believe very strongly that corporations have an important role to play, as does government. Hai did a great job in talking this morning about the different kinds of workplace flexibility, right? So workplace flexibility can include questions of when one works, where one works, and how much one works. So I'm not going to get into the details of different kinds of flexible work arrangements. I do want to read you one quote from a press conference that was held earlier this week at the National Press Club announcing a partnership between the Families and Work Institute and SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, that they're going to be working together to come up with solutions on workplace flexibility. The interim president and CEO of SHRM said at the press conference, speaking of workplace flexibility, if you think that this is one of those nice things to do for overstressed employees, you're wrong. This is the next business imperative. This is the next revolution in boosting productivity because empowering people to do their best at all stages of their lives, regardless of their industry, background, or culture, leads to innovation, a higher quality of work, more employee commitment, and yes, higher productivity. So I just want to briefly talk about all of the reasons why businesses, including Pfizer, recognize that promoting workplace flexibility is good for the bottom line. So obviously, promoting a whole range of workplace flexibility options reduces worker absenteeism, it reduces turnover, it really helps with the ability of firms to retain and attract workers, and again, it increases productivity. But an equally important benefit to promoting workplace flexibility that we feel like a lot of corporations believe in, but we want to hear more about, is the moral imperative, that it's good for the health and well-being of their workers. Workplace flexibility has been shown to lower stress and improve physical and mental health in employees. And studies also show that when parents have that flexibility in the workplace, and it could be a very small thing, that it leads to better outcomes for children. That children get better from illness when they have a parent at home to stay with them. And also children are less likely to engage in problematic behavior as they grow older in schools or whatever. Hai mentioned that there was a White House forum on workplace flexibility, which was historic, and President Obama made some very strong statements about how promoting workplace flexibility is important to men and women, and that it's going to be what makes our businesses competitive in the global economy. In the few minutes that I have left, I want to talk a little bit about some of the policy handles. And I guess in talking about them, I want us to all think about what are the opportunities for change and for partnership and for dialogue. Because I agree also with what Hai was saying, that sometimes when you just have the model of the progressives on the one end fighting against the corporations on the other end, that is not so productive. So paid family leave is the first example that I want to raise. As you know, we have the Family Medical Leave Act, which provides for unpaid leave, and that's really the only guarantee that we have on the federal level in this country. There are a few states that are making moves towards enacting paid family leave. California was the first. There's a California paid family leave law that's been on the books for 5 years. It's been studied, and what's interesting there is that the business community was up in arms fighting that proposal, and people were saying that the paid family leave law was going to be a job killer. In fact, the research now shows that it really has had a minimal impact on business operations. There are even employers in California who talk about how it's helped them save money, especially the larger employers that already provide some form of paid leave, whether it's sick leave or vacation leave or paid family leave, because the California paid leave provision is funded entirely through a payroll tax on employees. So there's no direct cost to employers. And so these large companies that already have some leave find that their workers can tack on to their existing leave with this new governmental benefit, and that it's a cost savings for them. And then there was also interesting studies coming out of California talking about how small businesses, which people are often very concerned about not being able to deal with these changes in the laws, how they've been very creative, and there's a wonderful diversity of ways in which small businesses in California have dealt with the paid family leave law and found ways to cover for workers who are absent and on leave. And so that's one example. The next example that I want to talk about is paid sick days, which other speakers today have referred to, and we've been engaged in a very hard fight in New York City for paid sick leave, which we have not won yet. And the importance of paid sick leave is that, unlike family medical leave, we feel that there should be some law in the books that provides some kind of escape valve or help for employees who are facing more day-to-day illnesses, like a sick child or a sick relative or their own illness. And you'd be surprised that millions of workers around the country have no paid sick leave. Often when we go around and talk to white-collar workers, they're surprised that low-income workers don't have paid sick leave. And we found that roughly 3/4 of low-wage workers, nearly half of middle-income workers, and even 1/3 of professional workers in this country don't have even a single day of paid sick leave. And again, there's a strong business case to be made here that providing minimal paid sick leave is good for business. And studies have shown that employees who come to work sick cost their employers $180 million a year. There's a lot of reform happening around this issue. Things are bubbling up all around the country. And stay tuned to see what will happen in New York City. And maybe if we have time in the Q&A, we can talk about some of the interesting ways that we were working with business on the Paid Sick Days campaign and ways that we were really hindered by what the business community was saying, despite the fact that we had a lot of small business allies in our fight for paid sick days here. Just briefly, a few other policy handles. We are also working on part-time parity, which we feel is important right now, especially with this recent recession, that there are more and more contingent or part-time workers in America, and this is still disproportionately a women's issue, and women are still, rising up in the ranks and finding that their incomes are carrying the family wage. And so there's a whole range of possibilities for trying to achieve part-time parity. On the one end, we might want to push for legislation that would promote parity, true parity in wages and benefits. And on the other hand, there just might be more education in the workplace about how part-time workers can contribute meaningfully. And there is a very promising trend in all kinds of workplaces of really looking at a results-oriented approach to evaluating work, that a worker can be effective even if they're not there all the time. And even in client-driven industries like the law, clients don't always expect their lawyer to be tied to the desk 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week, right? That there's technology that's going to help us serve our clients better with a lot more flexibility, including part-time. Another thing that I know that Hai's group has worked on a lot is the right to request. And that is something you may not have heard as much about. It's been talked about. It has not been enacted here in this country, but it really comes from the UK, where it's a very softball approach, but we feel that there's some promise there, that rather than requiring a business to provide a part-time position, say, that there would be a mechanism set up, that's the right to request, that there would be a mechanism where an employee could go request some kind of flexible work arrangement, and the employer has a certain time frame within which to respond to that request, and the answer may be no, but the employer has to give a reason. And so we feel like there's some promise there, and that maybe there could be a pilot program or some kind of mandate. Maybe there would be some kind of New York City law or New York State law that would set up a flexible right to request type of framework for employers. What I'll do now is just kind of try to return to some of the themes that came up with the prior speakers and start us thinking about questions in the Q&A and discussion. I feel like what's really interesting for me and hard is that we can agree, maybe talking about the business case, that there are important areas of commonality between employees and employers. But the hard question is, what do you do when that only gets you so far? So what do we do when the interests of workers and employers really diverge? So that's one question. And then the other thing that I feel very strongly is that I think there are different roles to play. So if you take a step back and think about social justice and trying to change working conditions and the lives of working families, that the model that Workplace 2010 set up of really coming into it without any preconceived notions, bringing employers together, bringing employee advocates together, and then coming up with a consensus-based model, I think is very important, and there's been important thinking and innovation that's come out of that. I think we've also heard from some of the other speakers that sometimes, and I think Hai recognized this too, that if you're pushing for something like a mandate, paid leave, that there's an important role for the worker centers and the advocates to play as well. One word on mandates, I mean, that's what we always find. It's a little bit frustrating as a legal advocacy organization that we're very friendly to employers, but at the end of the day, we are, because we're lawyers pushing for reform, we are pushing for that legal mandate. And we feel very strongly that having a mandate on the books plays a very important role in setting a floor, just a basic minimum floor of benefits. But there is one sort of optimistic story to come out about mandates and employers, which is that New York State has a domestic workers Bill of Rights that's become law. It's really historic. It's the first law like that in the country that provides basic labor standards to domestic workers. And there was very important organizing that went on with employers. And there were organized employers who came out in support of a mandate that they provide to their employees. And so that's one kernel of hope, I guess. I guess the last thing that I want to say before I open it up for questions is I do feel like there are different roles to play and there's more than one solution. And so if your focus is on low-wage workers, for example, that the flexible work arrangements that are being pushed and used and tried and studied that are really focusing on low-wage workers and large corporations is so exciting. And then I think that even if you're focusing on low-wage workers for other issues, that I think at the same time, again, pushing for the minimum wage, pushing for ending discrimination in the restaurant industry is so important too, and that you really need to think about how all these different pieces fit together. And I think that's what makes the field really fun and exciting, and there are some really interesting things going on around the country right now. So with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions. And I'm going to sit down. That's fine. Are there any questions? I want to make sure. How much time do we have, Laura?
It's currently 12:26. We're scheduled to end at 12:30, but we can probably go until 12:35 or 12:40.
Okay. Well, I see a hand, so I'd love to have the audience be able to participate.
Sure. Extra morning, we've got to do it.
So the prospect of finding solutions to some of these issues that are in theory win-wins for the employees and the employers is always tantalizing, but one of the areas that you oftentimes run into in some of these regulatory schemes is that the variance for small companies becomes prohibitively painful. So paid maternal leave, if you've got 100,000 workers, you can amortize it across your entire organization. That works, but for very small organizations, they can't. Even if on average it's good, if you're a 3-person company and 1/3 of you gets pregnant, all of a sudden the idea of paying that person for 6 months and being out of 1/3 of your workforce for 6 months becomes, problematic from a sustainability perspective. And that raises a question in my mind is, are we necessarily supposed to find the answers to these problems within the corporate firm itself versus larger schemes of kind of social insurance or government programs? I always wondered, why is it that I get my health care from my employer? It just seems like a bizarre place to get it. And so why is it that I necessarily need to get my paid sick leave or my maternity leave or things like that from my employer? Why not look outside the firm for answers to some of these questions, and then it solves the problem across the range of the corporate firm size?
I can start and then feel free to jump in. Is this working? Okay. So thank you for raising that question about small businesses. I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, the California paid leave example that I talked about was funded through an employee tax. It was a payroll tax. And California is one of a handful of states, including New York, that has a temporary disability insurance program. And I think that a lot of businesses can get behind funding paid family leave through a temporary disability insurance program. The harder question is, what do you do in the states that don't have that? I think it's just, a different question. But through whatever reason, right now the structure that we have is that a handful of states have TDI, temporary disability insurance, and we're actually working very hard in New York to try to pass a paid family leave provision here as well. Would anyone else like to jump in on that?
Maybe just,
Go ahead, Paul.
no, please. Just two thoughts. On the paid family leave and paid sick days stuff, the paid family leave first is not paid for by the employer, but the resistance, as Yolanda's been saying, is the employer's not wanting to have to find a substitute worker, even though they're not paying the wages, for the worker who's not on the job. The paid sick days is paid for by the employer, but it's a few percent on wages. The number of they've been very modest requirements, so that it's 2 or 3%. Maybe less than that. I can't remember what you cost.
I think it's like 48 cents an hour per worker.
It's a very small amount, but the resistance has been incredibly fierce from the business community, and I've really been surprised and sort of baffled that these are. And so most of the proposals have some exemption for small businesses below a certain size too. So it's a really interesting story why there hasn't been more kind of common ground, and why. Some have argued that they view it as a slippery slope, and that in principle these are not unmanageable, but that it'll lead to who knows what sort of new unprecedented labor standards. So it's something that bears, but because it feels like there've been good business allies, but not as many as there should be, and it's been a little surprising. On your point about social insurance, that's a very sensible, straightforward way that many other countries, provide these public goods, but that's sort of not our way in the United States. There's just not the political appetite for it. So for better or for worse, much of these sorts of the healthcare system, but also. The minimum wage too. You could have a much more redistributive tax and transfer system and obviate some of the need to sustain minimally adequate incomes through wages. But that's just not our political system. We do it modestly in the earned income tax credit. We have some safety net programs, but if you're following what's happening in Washington, where aside from the healthcare reform bill, no one's really talking about expanding those types of programs. So for better or for worse, that most of our policy work follows this model. So.
Yeah, all I was going to say is that beyond things like workplace flexibility and paid sick leave, you know, there are things that I think have to come from the private sector, that has to come from the employer themselves. And the example that I'm thinking of is going back to my theme on discrimination, occupational segregation. What about job training? What about internal promotions policies? I mean, even from the restaurant industry, what we continually hear from small businesses is, how can you expect me to, you know, I certainly can't have an HR department. I may not even have an employee manual, and I can't provide, you know, on-the-job training. And I think our response is, that's right. And there's a couple things that we as advocates would do. We would, you know, even pressure our policymakers to make it a little bit easier on small businesses to, in fact, do the right thing. So that might mean providing incentives or subsidies to businesses to provide on-the-job training and make it more likely and equitable for them to compete with the larger businesses. But then I think the other thing is simply that, you know, you have to be able to go to the businesses, the big industry leaders that are that do have the capacity and resources to implement things like, let's say, on-the-job training or paid sick leave, and you know, hope that if it starts with them, that others will follow eventually. I do think regulatorily you need to be able to set the bars through mandates, but I think in the meantime, you know, I think there is room, at least in our industry, where you can be engaged in those big corporate players.
I have two quick questions. One, I wanted to know more about what's happening in California with the paid sick days in terms of, our low-wage worker, like, is every worker required to pay the tax? And are there litigation around a low-wage worker, for example, who wants to take the time off, and there's, you know, is the government or do the employers can say, no, they don't qualify for this time off? And then the other thing I wanted to ask, I think the professor about, you know, I'm kind of been thinking about this diversity for diversity's sake. Like, what's so great about having people of color as CEOs if they're going to continue to do the same thing they've always done, just they're just darker hued? There's no shortage of people of color willing to exploit people of color. And so have there been studies about having diversity at management level? Does that really change the social structure and impact that that corporation have on low-wage people of color and just low-wage people, or just, you know, our society? Why don't you start with the second question?
Yeah, in fact, I think there are two reasons to think that having people of color in management jobs will change the way business operates. One reason is we have some results showing that companies that have one African American or female top manager, or especially two minority or female top managers, start to see significant growth in diversity in the mid-level management ranks. So the approach of most companies has been to diversify at the bottom, but a much more effective approach, if you want to see more diversity in the middle of a firm, is to try to find people to appoint at the top. And I think what you see is companies that do that have less turnover of minority employees, of women employees, and they attract more minorities and women. So the second thing I think we see, and this goes back to Sandra's remarks earlier about implicit bias, is that we know from the studies that Sandra was citing, the research she was talking about, that people's implicit bias changes when there are people of color and women in positions of power. That is, the way to change bias is to give people role models that will change their stereotypes. And I think almost all the research in the implicit bias literature says the best thing to do is to put an African American or a Hispanic at the top of a company and have people get used to that.
Just quickly on your first question, yes, I think you were asking is who pays for?
Is it mandated, and have low-wage workers taken advantage of it, or had any option?
Okay, I remember now. So the payroll tax in California is assessed on everyone, and the law covers basically all private sector workers. It excludes self-employed people, but self-employed people can opt in, and it excludes public sector workers because they're covered by their collective bargaining agreements. There is a problem in California with low-wage workers and minorities not knowing about the benefit. And so there's a huge drive to do more public education now around that. And the second part of your question, I thank you for raising it too, is this whole fear of retaliation. You see that across the board, and I had meant to mention it, so thank you. So a lot of these laws have anti-retaliation provisions in them. They're very important, they're crucial, and you know, at all the different companies that we see that where there's workplace flexibility or leave policies, we still hear very often about employees being afraid to make use of those policies. So there's definitely more work that needs to be done, and there is protection in the law that where workers who feel they've been retaliated against could, you know, seek redress through the courts.
If there's time, I wanted to comment quickly on what's the impact of people of color in CEO or CEO minus one positions. And I want to go further on the implicit bias. One of the things we were talking about the other day was I think it would be very informative to look at boards and do an analysis against cultural, global diversity on the boards and some of that impact as well. Because I bring that up because you see a positive correlation. And it's part of, and the whole research on implicit bias is profound. If you've not investigated that, pull up Dr. Banaji out of Harvard, wonderful research, great material, and you see that positive impact there. But you also need to look at cultural dominance in that as well to see why it's working or why it might not be working. Because I'm using that quote next week on my leadership committee meeting, just at a darker hue. I thought that was, I mean, why is it working in some places and then not others? Well, part of that issue is the dominant culture, and is it a similar dominant culture? That might be the issue versus the ethnicity or global diverse, if you will, of the individual. So, for example, we named a new CEO, Ian Reed, who totally gets the diversity thing, by the way. He's like, really gets it. But there was still a filter saying, well, what are we saying, though, to the world? Because what they're going to see is two Caucasian, you know, males, right? And what you heard a lot of press around, oh, he's from the UK, non-US centric. We really know our image of the market. So don't worry, you can tell me, talk to me frankly. We understand that image about the, you know. And so you heard everyone talking about the UK, you know, male, oh, there's more diversity up there. And that caused us to cringe. Because for us, that was embarrassing. Why? Because they're both the same dominant culture. So US, the UK, Australia, China, France, not outlier, they're the same dominant culture. So I would bring in a person of color who still operates under a hierarchical, strong, direct, dominant culture and then not see the change. Does that make sense? So I think part of that is adding into that cultural filter, global cultural filter, because then you get innovation. And then I think you also get something beyond, I mean, just breaking the ice on implicit bias. So my 2 cents.
I'm looking at Laura. Are we? Okay. So do you want to?
Sure. So sorry, we're out of time on this panel. So please find our speakers during one of the breaks if you have a question for them.